Today we have a story about a woman named Rose, who, according to official records, died in 1850, but in 1901, she was found alive in Canada, a discovery that raised questions about erased identities, false deaths, and lives deliberately made to disappear. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. This account comes from papers discovered in the archives of St. Catharines, Ontario. The handwriting is careful, deliberate. The ink has faded to brown. The pages smell of dust and time. Rose was born in the spring of 1835 on the Whitmore plantation in Colleton County, South Carolina. She never knew her mother. The woman who birthed her, a woman named Abigail, was sold 3 days later to a plantation in Georgia. This was common practice. Rose was raised by an elderly woman called Old Mary, who cared for 11 children in a single cabin with dirt floors and a roof that leaked when it rained. Rose's father was unknown. In the plantation ledgers, she was listed simply as Rose, female, born spring 1835, value to be determined. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of low country soil. The main house was white-columned, grand, positioned to overlook fields that ran to the horizon. Behind it, hidden by a line of oak trees, stood 32 slave quarters arranged in 4 rows. No windows, dirt floors, walls that could not keep out the cold. Samuel Whitmore owned the plantation. He was 42 years old when Rose was born, a third-generation landowner who prided himself on what he called modern management techniques. His letters, preserved now in university archives, reveal a man obsessed with efficiency. He wrote about human beings as if they were machinery. He calculated the optimal number of lashes to motivate without causing permanent injury. He discussed breeding strategies in the same tone others might discuss crop rotation. Rose's earliest memory was standing at the edge of the cotton fields, watching the workers move in long rows. She was perhaps 4 or 5 years old. An overseer sat on horseback at the field's edge, a whip coiled at his side. The workers bent at the waist, dragging canvas sacks that grew heavier as the sun climbed. Among them was her brother. Everyone called him Little Sam to distinguish him from Samuel Whitmore. Little Sam was 9 years older than Rose. He had been 12 when their mother was sold, old enough to remember her face, old enough to carry that loss like a stone in his chest. He was one of the fastest cotton pickers on the plantation, which was both blessing and curse. His speed set the standard others were expected to meet. Rose worked alongside Old Mary in those early years, carrying water to the fields, feeding chickens, pulling weeds from the small vegetable gardens the enslaved community was permitted to maintain. She watched, she learned, she understood without being told that her childhood would be brief. The plantation operated on a system of rules about when to wake, when to work, when to eat, when to sleep. Rules about speaking, about looking, about where you could walk and where you could not. Rules that were never written down but everyone knew, because breaking them meant punishment. Thomas Garrett was the overseer. He was a tall man with sun-damaged skin and eyes that never seemed to blink. He carried a leather whip on his belt and a small notebook in his pocket. In the notebook, he recorded infractions. A woman who moved too slowly, a man who looked up when spoken to, a child who cried too loudly. Rose learned to be quiet. She learned to move without drawing attention. She learned to make herself small. But there was something else she learned, something that would matter later. She learned to read. The Whitmore plantation had a chapel, a small wooden building where Samuel Whitmore's wife, a woman named Catherine, taught Sunday school to the white children of the neighboring plantations. Rose was sometimes assigned to clean the chapel on Saturday afternoons. One day, she found a primer left on a bench. The book was simple, meant for children learning their letters. Rose opened it. The symbols on the page meant nothing to her, but she traced them with her finger. She felt something stir inside her, a hunger she could not name. She began to steal moments with books. When she cleaned the chapel, when she dusted the main house, when she was sent to fetch something from the overseer's office, she taught herself slowly, carefully, matching letters to sounds, sounds to words. She told no one. Literacy was forbidden. Discovery would mean punishment, but Rose kept learning anyway. By the time she turned 12, she could read well enough to understand the ledgers in the overseer's office. She saw her own name there, her brother's name, Old Mary's name. She saw their assigned values, like livestock. She saw the names of people who had been sold. their destinations recorded in Thomas Garrett's neat handwriting. She saw the word deceased next to names she recognized, people who had died in the fields, in childbirth, from illness, from punishment. She understood then that these records were how they kept track of property, how they accounted for loss, how they marked the end of a person who had been reduced to a number on a page. And she understood something else. If a person was marked deceased in these ledgers, that person ceased to exist. Their death was final, official, undisputed. Rose did not know it yet, but she had just learned the method of her own escape. The summer of 1857 was brutally hot. The cotton grew thick and high, and every hand was needed for the harvest. Rose was 22 years old. She had been working in the fields for 15 years. Her hands were calloused, her back ached constantly, and she had learned to move through the days like a ghost, present but invisible. Then came the morning when Thomas Garrett made his announcement. Samuel Whitmore had purchased new property in Mississippi. 40 enslaved people would be transported there to clear the land and establish a new cotton operation. The list of names would be posted that evening. Rose felt something cold settle in her stomach. Separation was the weapon slaveholders used most cruelly. Families were torn apart on a whim, sold for profit, moved for convenience. You could wake up beside someone and never see them again. That evening, she read the list posted outside the overseer's office. Her brother's name was there. Little Sam would be sent to Mississippi in 2 weeks. Rose stood in the darkness and felt the world narrow to a single point of understanding. She had to do something. She had to act, because once little Sam was gone, she would never see him again. And in that moment, the idea came to her fully formed, terrible and clear. She would die. The morning after the list was posted, Rose went to work in the fields as usual. She picked cotton beside the other women, filled her sack, kept her head down, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities, calculating risks. She had 2 weeks, 14 days before they would take little Sam away. Thomas Garrett made his rounds on horseback, watching the workers with that unblinking stare. He carried his notebook, his whip, his authority like a cloak. When he passed Rose, he did not look at her. To him, she was just another pair of hands, another unit of productivity. This was her advantage, her invisibility. That evening, after the work bell rang, Rose found little Sam near the well. He was washing the dirt from his hands, his movements slow with exhaustion. When he saw her, he tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "I heard about Mississippi," Rose said quietly. Little Sam nodded. He did not speak. "I won't let them take you," she said. He looked at her then, and his expression was heartbreaking in its resignation. "Rose, there ain't nothing to be done. You know that." "Maybe there is," she said, but she did not explain, not yet, because the plan forming in her mind was too fragile, too dangerous to speak aloud. Over the next days, Rose began to gather what she needed. Information. First, she paid attention to the rhythms of the plantation. When the overseers made their rounds, when the dogs were fed, when the gates were locked and unlocked, she noted the places where the fences were weak, where the woods came closest to the quarters. She also paid attention to the records. Thomas Garrett kept the plantation ledgers in his office, a small building near the main house. She had cleaned that office many times. She knew where the ledgers were stored, how they were organized. She knew that Thomas locked the office every night, but she also knew that the lock was old and poorly maintained. One night, after everyone was asleep, Rose slipped out of her cabin and made her way to the overseer's office. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a soft click. Inside, she lit a candle stub she had saved. The ledgers were exactly where she remembered. She opened the current volume and found her own entry. Rose, female, age 22, field worker, value $900. She stared at those words for a long moment. Then she turned to the section where deaths were recorded. The entries were brief. Name, date, cause of death. The causes varied. Fever, childbirth, complications, accident, animal attack. The last one caught her attention. Animal attack. It was vague. It implied a body torn apart, perhaps unrecognizable. It implied remains that might not be found. Rose closed the ledger carefully. She extinguished the candle. She locked the office behind her and returned to her cabin. The next day, she began to spread rumors. She mentioned to old Mary that she had seen a wild boar near the edge of the swamp. She mentioned to another woman that the overseer's dogs had been acting strange, growling at something in the darkness. She mentioned to a third that she had heard screaming in the night, though she could not say if it was human or animal. These were small seeds, planted carefully. They would grow. Meanwhile, Thomas Garrett grew more watchful. Rose noticed him observing the workers more closely, noting who spoke to whom, who seemed distracted or nervous. The overseer was not a stupid man. He knew that forced separation bred desperation, and desperation bred rebellion. One afternoon, he called Rose aside. "You've been working here long?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Since I was 7. You got family on this plantation?" Rose hesitated. "A brother, sir." Thomas consulted his notebook. "Samuel, he's on the Mississippi list." "Yes, sir." "That bother you?" Rose kept her eyes down. "It ain't my place to be bothered, sir." Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then he made a mark in his notebook and waved her away. That night, Rose could not sleep. She lay in the darkness of the cabin, listening to the breathing of the other women, and felt fear coiling in her stomach. Thomas Garrett suspected something. Not the specific plan. He could not possibly imagine what she was planning, but he sensed unrest. She would have to move carefully. The following Sunday, Rose attended the chapel service. This was required for all enslaved people on the plantation. Samuel Whitmore's wife, Catherine, led the service, reading from scripture about obedience and submission. The message was clear. Your suffering is ordained by God, and resistance is sin. Rose sat in the back row, head bowed, hands folded, but she was not praying. She was listening to the rain drumming on the roof, watching the way the candlelight flickered in the drafts, calculating distances and timing dot after the service. As everyone filed out, Rose deliberately lingered. She pretended to straighten the benches, to tidy the hymn. Catherine Whitmore noticed her. "You are very diligent," Catherine said, her voice sweet and patronizing. "Thank you, ma'am," Rose replied, keeping her tone humble. "You've always been a good girl," Catherine continued, "not like some of the others. You understand your place." Rose nodded, though the words burned. Catherine Whitmore thought she was compliant, broken, grateful even. The woman had no idea. That night, the dreams came. Rose dreamed of the swamp. She dreamed of water the color of rust, of cypress trees draped in moss, of things moving beneath the surface. She dreamed of screaming, though she could not tell if it was her own voice or someone else's. She woke in darkness, her heart pounding. 11 days until they took little Sam away. The next morning, Rose went to the fields and worked until her hands bled. She kept her head down, her movements steady. But inside, she was counting days, counting hours, counting the moments until she would have to act. Thomas Garrett watched her from his horse. She could feel his gaze like a weight on her back. That evening, another name was added to the Mississippi list. A woman named Dinah, who had been born on the plantation the same year as Rose. Dinah had 3 children, all under the age of 10. They would not be going with her. When Dinah read her name on the list, she collapsed. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply folded to the ground like something broken. Rose helped her to her feet. She held the woman while she shook with silent sobs, and she felt her own resolve harden into something cold and immovable. They would not take little Sam. They would not take Dinah. They would not take anyone else, because Rose was going to die, and in dying, she was going to disappear. 9 days remained. The plantation felt different now. There was a tension in the air that everyone could sense but no one dared name. The overseers moved through the fields with rifles instead of just whips. The dogs were loosed at night to patrol the perimeter. Samuel Whitmore himself rode out to observe the workers, his face stern and watchful. Change was coming, and everyone knew it. Rose kept to her routine. She woke before dawn, worked until dusk, returned to the cabin, exhausted. But every spare moment was spent preparing. She stole scraps of canvas and rope from the supply shed. She hid them beneath the floorboards of her cabin. She studied the swamp's edge, learning the paths, the shallow places, the deep places. The swamp was dangerous. Everyone knew this. It was filled with snakes and alligators, with sinkholes that could swallow a person whole, with fevers that came from the water itself. People who ran into the swamp rarely returned. Their bodies, when found, were usually beyond recognition. This was exactly what Rose needed. She also began visiting old Mary more frequently. The old woman was in her 70s now, her body bent from decades of labor. She spent her days in the cabin, watching over the youngest children while their parents worked the fields. Old Mary had known Rose since birth. She had been the closest thing to her mother Rose had ever had. "You planning something?" Old Mary said one evening. It was not a question. Rose paused in the act of mending a shirt. No, Mum, don't lie to me, child. I've been alive too long to be fooled. Rose set down the needle. She looked at old Mary's weathered face, at eyes that had seen unspeakable things, and somehow remained kind. If I was planning something, Rose said carefully, would you want to know? Old Mary was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No, what I don't know can't be beaten out of me. Rose nodded. She understood. But Rose, old Mary continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, whatever you're planning, you remember this. They want you to believe you got no choices. They want you to believe you've got no power, but you're still alive. That means you still got both. Rose felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away. That night, she lay awake and thought about power, about the small, secret kinds of power that existed even in bondage, the power to refuse, even if only in your mind, the power to plan, even if the plan seemed impossible, the power to hope, even when hope felt like foolishness. 7 days remained. Thomas Garrett called a meeting of all the enslaved people. They gathered in the yard between the cabins as the sun set, casting long shadows across the dirt. There's been talk, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the crowd. Talk of running, talk of resistance. I want to be clear about something. Anyone who runs will be caught. Anyone who resists will be punished. And punishment won't just fall on the guilty. It'll fall on their families, their friends, anyone who might have known and failed to report. He let that sink in. Then he continued. The Mississippi group leaves in 7 days. Anyone whose name is on that list, you will be ready. You will not cause trouble. You will not make this difficult. Do I make myself understood? A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Rose stood near the back, her face carefully blank, but inside, her mind was racing. Thomas was tightening control, increasing fear. He was trying to prevent exactly what Rose was planning. She would have to be smarter. After the meeting, Rose found little Sam. He was standing alone near the well, staring at nothing. I need you to trust me, she said quietly. He looked at her. Rose, I need you to trust me, she repeated. Can you do that? He was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. In 6 days, she said, before they take you, something is going to happen. When it does, no matter what you see or hear, you have to stay calm. You have to act like you don't know anything. Can you do that? Little Sam's expression was troubled. What are you planning? The less you know, the safer you are. Rose, if you're thinking about running, I'm not running, she said. And it was true. What she was planning was something else entirely. 5 days remained. Rose began to complain of headaches. She mentioned them to the other women in her cabin, to old Mary, to the overseer when he made his rounds. She worked more slowly, pausing to press her hand to her temple, wincing as if in pain. Thomas Garrett noticed. He made a note in his book. 4 days remained. The headaches worsened. Rose stumbled while carrying water. She vomited behind the cabins. The other women looked at her with concern. Illness spread quickly in the quarters. If Rose had fever, others would soon follow. Thomas sent for the plantation doctor, a white man named Dr. Miller, who treated both the Whitmore family and their human property. Though with vastly different levels of care, Dr. Miller examined Rose briefly. He felt her forehead, looked at her tongue, asked a few questions. Then he prescribed rest and water. She'll be fine in a few days, he told Thomas. Probably just exhaustion. But Rose did not get better. 3 days remained. She developed a fever. Her skin burned. She could barely stand. The women in her cabin took turns caring for her, bringing her water, wiping her face with damp cloths. Old Mary sat beside her and held her hand. You're a good actress, the old woman whispered when they were alone. Rose managed a weak smile. 2 days remained. Rose grew worse. The fever seemed to consume her. She thrashed in her sleep, called out in delirium. The women were frightened now. They had seen fevers like this before. They had watched people die from them. Thomas Garrett came to check on her. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his expression unreadable. Can she work? He asked. No, sir, one of the women replied. She can barely stand. Thomas made a note in his book. Then he left. 1 day remained before the Mississippi group was scheduled to depart. That evening, as the sun set, Rose slipped out of the cabin. The other women thought she was delirious, wandering in fever madness. They tried to bring her back, but she fought them with surprising strength. Let her go, old Mary said quietly. She needs to walk it off. The women reluctantly obeyed. Rose stumbled toward the swamp. Behind her, she could hear voices calling, but they grew fainter. The fever was real now. She had made herself sick through sheer force of will, through lack of food and water, through pushing her body past its limits, but she was also in control. Barely she reached the edge of the swamp just as darkness fell. The water was black, reflecting nothing. The air smelled of rot and growing things. She had hidden the canvas and rope here days ago. She retrieved them now, her hands shaking. Then she heard the dogs. Thomas Garrett had sent the dogs after her. Their barking grew louder. Closer. Rose waded into the water. It was cold, deeper than she expected. She moved quickly, following the path she had memorized. Behind her, the dogs reached the swamp's edge. They barked frantically but would not enter the water. Men's voices joined the barking. Torches appeared between the trees. Rose kept moving. The water rose to her waist, then her chest. She could feel things brushing against her legs. Fish, snakes. She did not know. She tried not to think about alligators. She reached the place she had chosen, a deep pool surrounded by cypress trees. This was where she would stage her death. She took the canvas and tore it with her teeth, creating ragged strips. She scattered them on the water's surface, on the muddy bank. She smeared blood from a cut on her arm across one piece. She dropped the rope into the water, letting it sink. Then she screamed. It was a terrible sound, full of fear and pain. It echoed across the swamp, bouncing off the trees. She screamed again, then cut herself off abruptly. Silence fell. Rose submerged herself completely, swimming underwater away from the pool. Her lungs burned. Her vision darkened. But she kept swimming, following the current, putting distance between herself and the place where she had screamed. When she finally surfaced, gasping, the torches were far behind her. The voices were faint. She had done it. She had died. The search party found the scattered canvas at dawn. They found the blood, the rope, the disturbed mud. They found no body, but this was not unusual. The swamp did not always give back what it took. Thomas Garrett stood at the edge of the pool and looked at the evidence. His face was grim. "Animal attack," he said finally. "Probably alligator. Dragged her under." The other men nodded. They had seen it before. The swamp was unforgiving. They returned to the plantation as the sun rose. Thomas went directly to his office and opened the ledger. He found Rose's entry and wrote beside it, "Deceased, September 1858, animal attack, body not recovered." He calculated her value at $800 and marked it as a loss. Then he drew a single line through her name. Rose ceased to exist. Meanwhile, Rose herself was 3 miles downstream, hiding in a hollow beneath the roots of a massive cypress tree. She was soaked, shivering, covered in mud. Her fever was real now, not feigned but genuine. The result of hours in cold water and exposure. She had no food, no water, no supplies except what she had hidden in this spot weeks ago. A small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, dried meat, a knife, a change of clothes stolen piece by piece from the laundry, and a piece of paper. The paper was the most important item. It was a traveling pass, forged in her own careful handwriting. It identified the bearer as a free woman named Grace Holloway, traveling from Charleston to visit family in Georgia. Rose had practiced the signature dozens of times. She had studied the passes she had seen when cleaning the overseer's office. She had made herself literate for exactly this purpose. She changed out of her wet clothes and into the dry ones. She ate a small piece of the dried meat, though her stomach rebelled. She forced herself to drink from the stream, though the water tasted of earth and decay. Then she lay down in the hollow and let the fever take her. She dreamed of little Sam. In the dream, he was being loaded onto a wagon bound for Mississippi. He looked back at the plantation, searching for her face among the crowd, but she was not there. She was dead, gone, erased. The dream shifted. Now she saw old Mary, weeping over the news of Rose's death. She saw the other women from her cabin, their faces marked with grief. She saw the list of names for Mississippi, still posted outside the overseer's office. She saw Thomas Garrett striking her name from the ledger. When Rose woke, it was night. Her fever had broken. Her body ached, but she was alive. She gathered her small bundle and began to walk. The swamp was disorienting in darkness. Every direction looked the same, but Rose had studied the stars when she could, had learned to navigate by the North Star. She kept it in sight and moved slowly, carefully. By dawn, she had reached the edge of the swamp. Beyond it lay farmland, then roads, then the wider world. She paused at the boundary. Behind her was everything she had ever known. the plantation, the quarters, the people who had been her family, little Sam, old Mary, all of it. Ahead was the unknown. Rose took a breath. Then she stepped out of the swamp and onto solid ground. She was Grace Holloway now, a free woman, or at least, a woman pretending to be free. The next weeks were a blur of fear and movement. Grace, walked during the day, using backroads and paths through the woods. She avoided towns where possible, avoided speaking to anyone. When she had to interact with people, she showed them her pass and kept her answers brief. The pass worked. People glanced at it, nodded, waved her on. A black woman traveling alone was unusual but not impossible. The pass made her legitimate, legal, safe. At night, she slept in barns, under bridges, in the woods. She rationed her food carefully. She drank from streams and wells. She kept moving north. The fever returned twice. Both times, she found a hidden place and waited it out, delirious and alone. Both times, she survived. After 3 weeks, she reached Georgia. The landscape had changed. More hills, different trees, unfamiliar towns. She began to feel the weight of what she had done. She had faked her death. She had abandoned everyone she loved. She was alone in a way she had never been before, but she was also free. In a town whose name she never learned. Rose stopped at a small church. It was Sunday morning, and she could hear singing from inside. She sat on the steps and listened. A black woman emerged from the church. She was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "You look lost, child," the woman said. Grace looked up at her, and for the first time since fleeing the swamp, she spoke the truth. "I am," she said. The woman's name was Margaret. She was a free black woman who ran a small school for colored children out of her home. She took one look at Grace and understood without being told that this was a woman running from something. "You hungry?" Margaret asked. Grace nodded. "Come on then." Margaret took her home, fed her, gave her a place to sleep. Over the next days, Grace slowly told her story. Not all of it. She was still too afraid to speak openly, but enough. Margaret listened without judgment. "You're planning to keep running?" Margaret asked finally. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I don't know where to go." "North," Margaret said simply. "Keep going north until you cross into free territory. Then you'll be safe." "How far is that?" "Far. Months of walking, maybe longer, and dangerous every step of the way." Grace felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. "But you can do it," Margaret continued. "You've made it this far. That takes strength." Over the next weeks, Margaret helped Grace prepare. She gave her better clothes, better shoes, a warmer coat. She taught her about the routes north, the safe houses, the people who might help. She gave her money, not much, but enough. And she gave her something else, a new identity. "Grace Holloway is too close to who you were," Margaret said. "You need a new name, a fresh start." Together, they created a new story. Grace became Ruth Freeman, a widow from Virginia traveling to Canada to join relatives. Margaret even provided false documents to support the story. "Why are you helping me, Ruth asked. Margaret smiled sadly. "Because someone helped me once. And because if we don't help each other, who will?" The night before Ruth was to leave, Margaret took her aside. "Listen to me," she said. "What you're doing is dangerous. You could be caught. You could be killed. But it's also the bravest thing I've ever seen. You're taking your life back. Don't let anyone tell you that's wrong." Ruth, who had been Grace, who had been Rose, nodded. She felt tears on her cheeks but did not wipe them away. The next morning, she resumed her journey north. Ruth walked for 4 months, through Georgia, into Tennessee, through Kentucky. The journey was brutal. Her feet blistered and bled. She slept in ditches, in abandoned buildings, once in a cemetery behind a church. She ate when she could find food, went hungry when she could not. Several times, she was stopped by white men demanding to see her papers. Each time, her heart hammered in her chest as she produced the forged documents. Each time they let her pass. Once, she was nearly caught. A slave catcher recognized something in her eyes. The wariness, the fear that free people did not carry. He questioned her for an hour, searching for holes in her story. But Ruth held firm. She did not break. Eventually, he let her go. Though she felt his suspicious gaze following her down the road, she learned to trust no one completely. She learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the smallest sound. She learned to read the landscape for danger. Certain towns were safe, others were not. Certain roads were watched, others were clear. And she learned about the network. It was never explicitly named, But Ruth came to understand that there were people, both black and white, who helped escaped slaves move north. They left signs, a quilt with a certain pattern, a candle in a window, a mark on a fence post. Ruth learned to recognize these signs and follow them. The network led her to safe houses, barns where she could sleep unseen, homes where sympathetic people would feed her and hide her, churches where ministers looked the other way. In Ohio, she met a Quaker family who sheltered her for a week. They gave her proper food, medical attention for her infected feet, and most importantly, information. Canada, the father told her, that's where you need to go. Cross the border and you'll be truly free. No more fugitive laws, no more slave catchers. How far? Ruth asked. Couple months of travel. If you move carefully. Ruth absorbed this. 2 more months. She could do 2 more months. The Quaker family also gave her something unexpected. A letter. It was addressed to a man in Ontario, a black community leader who helped newly arrived fugitives establish themselves. Give him this when you arrive, the father said. He'll help you. Ruth tucked the letter carefully into her bundle. By winter she had reached Detroit. The city was loud, crowded, dangerous. Ruth kept to the edges, moving through alleys and back streets. She worked for a week washing dishes in a tavern to earn enough money for the river crossing. The Detroit River was the final barrier. On the other side lay Canada. Freedom. Ruth paid a boatman to take her across at night. The crossing took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. She sat in the small boat, watching the dark water slip past, and thought about everyone she had left behind. Little Sam. Had they taken him to Mississippi? Was he still alive? Old Mary. Was she still caring for children in that cramped cabin? The women who had nursed her through her fake fever. Did they mourn her? And what about the names in the ledger? All those people marked as property, as losses, as deceased. Ruth had escaped, but they had not. The boat reached the Canadian shore just before dawn. Ruth stepped onto solid ground and felt something shift inside her. For the first time in months, she could breathe fully. She was in Canada. She was free. But freedom, she soon learned, was more complicated than she had imagined. Ruth arrived in St. Catharines, Ontario in January of 1859. The town was small but growing, home to a community of black refugees who had fled American slavery. Many of them were struggling. They had no money, no resources, no support system. They lived in shacks, worked whatever jobs they could find, and survived day to day. Ruth delivered her letter to the man the Quaker family had mentioned. His name was Daniel Mason, and he ran a small church that served as a community center for black refugees. Daniel read the letter, then looked at Ruth with eyes that had seen too much suffering. Welcome to Canada, he said. You're safe now, but safe don't mean easy. He helped Ruth find a room in a boarding house run by a black woman named Evelyn Porter. The room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but it was hers. Ruth paid for it with the last of her money. You'll need work, Evelyn said. I can ask around. Within a week, Ruth had found employment as a laundress. The work was hard. Her hands were constantly raw from lye soap and hot water, but it was honest work, and she was paid for it. This was new, being paid for her labor, having money that was hers to keep. Slowly, Ruth began to build a life. She made friends with other refugees, women who had walked the same long road she had. They shared stories, strategies, hope. And Ruth began to learn. She learned that many of the refugees were illiterate. They could not read, could not write, could not navigate the systems that governed their new lives. Ruth remembered the hours she had spent teaching herself to read by candlelight in the chapel. She remembered the power that literacy had given her, the ability to forge a pass, to understand a contract, to claim her own story. She approached Daniel Mason with an idea. I want to teach, she said. Reading, writing, for the children, for anyone who wants to learn. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. You know how to read? Yes. How? Ruth hesitated. Then she told him part of her story, how she had taught herself in secret, how she had used that knowledge to escape. Daniel nodded slowly. We need teachers. God knows we need teachers. But Ruth, this won't be easy. You'll have to work for free at first. We don't have money to pay you. I'll manage, Ruth said. And so Ruth Freeman, who had been Grace Holloway, who had been Rose from the Whitmore plantation, became a teacher. She started with 5 students in the back room of Daniel's church. All of them were children. All of them were former slaves, or the children of former slaves. Ruth taught them letters, then words, then sentences. She taught them to read and write their own names. The class grew. Within months, she had 20 students. Then 30 adults began attending as well. Sitting in the back and learning alongside the children, Ruth discovered that she loved teaching. It gave her purpose, direction. It transformed her from a woman running from her past into a woman building a future. But she never forgot where she came from. At night, lying in her small room, Ruth would think about the plantation, about the ledger where her name had been crossed out, about all the people still trapped in bondage, their lives reduced to numbers on a page. And she began to write. Ruth wrote in the evenings by candlelight. At first, she wrote about her own experiences, the plantation, the escape, the journey north. The words poured out of her in a flood, all the fear, the pain, the small victories and large defeats. But as she wrote, she realized something. Her story was important, but it was not complete. What about the others? What about little Sam, old Mary, Dinah, all the people whose names appeared in that ledger? Ruth decided to write their stories too, not from first-hand experience. She could not know what had happened to them after her escape, but from memory. She wrote down everything she could remember about the plantation, the layout of the quarters, the names of the overseers, the brutal efficiency of Samuel Whitmore's operation. She wrote about Thomas Garrett's notebook, about the way he recorded infractions, calculated punishments, tracked productivity. She wrote about Dr. Miller, who treated enslaved people like livestock. She wrote about Catherine Whitmore, with her sweet voice and cruel indifference. She named names. She documented crimes. The writing was difficult. Every word forced her to relive trauma she had tried to bury. But Ruth persisted, because she understood that this was her power now. The power to bear witness, the power to testify. By 1860, Ruth had filled 3 notebooks with her testimony. She kept them hidden beneath the floorboards of her room, afraid someone might find them and destroy them. Then, the war came. The American Civil War broke out in 1861. News traveled slowly to Canada, but when it arrived, it transformed the refugee community. People who had fled to escape slavery now watched as their former country tore itself apart over the institution that had brutalized them. Ruth followed the news closely. She read newspapers when she could afford them, listened to discussions at Daniel's church. As the war progressed, she heard about the Emancipation Proclamation, about black soldiers fighting for the Union, about the slow, bloody dismantling of the slave system. And she thought about the ledger, the Whitmore plantation ledger, with its neat columns and crossed-out names, the record that declared her dead, the archive of atrocity. After the war ended in 1865, Ruth made a decision. She would publish her testimony, not anonymously, but under her real name, Rose Freeman, reclaiming the name she had been given at birth, adding the surname she had chosen for herself. It took 3 years to find a publisher willing to take the risk. Many rejected her outright. Her story was too painful, too accusatory. But finally, a small abolitionist press in Toronto agreed. The testimony of Rose Freeman, a narrative of slavery and freedom, was published in 1860-8. The book was brief, barely 100 pages, but it was devastating. Ruth wrote in plain, unadorned language about life on the Whitmore plantation. She described the violence, the separations, the dehumanization. She named Samuel Whitmore, Thomas Garrett, Dr. Miller. She included details from the plantation ledgers, information she had memorized during her secret reading sessions. The book did not become famous immediately. It sold modestly, mostly to abolitionist societies and churches. But it circulated, people read it, and slowly, it began to have an impact. In South Carolina, descendants of the Whitmore family read the book with horror and denial. They claimed Ruth was lying, that she had invented the whole story. They insisted that Samuel Whitmore had been a kind master, that his plantation had been humane by the standards of the time. But Ruth had evidence. She had dates, names, specific incidents, and as historians began to investigate, they found corroboration. The plantation ledgers still existed, preserved in county archives. The records matched Ruth's account exactly, including the entry that declared her dead in 1850-8. The discovery made news. Newspapers in Canada and the United States reported on the woman who had faked her own death to escape slavery. Some praised her courage, others condemned her for deception, but everyone agreed on one thing: her story was extraordinary. Ruth received letters from all over. Some were supportive, thanking her for her bravery. Others were hateful, accusing her of dishonoring her former masters, of spreading lies. She answered none of them. Instead, she continued teaching, continued writing, continued building her life in Canada. But the book had another effect, one Ruth had not anticipated. People began to come forward with their own stories. Other refugees, other survivors, people who had read Ruth's testimony and felt compelled to add their voices. They wrote to her, visited her, asked if she would help them document their experiences. Ruth said yes. Over the next decade, she collected dozens of testimonies. She interviewed former slaves, recorded their stories, preserved their memories. She created an archive of suffering and survival, a record that could not be erased or denied. And she sent copies of everything to historical societies, to universities, to anyone who would preserve them. This was her revenge, not violence, not destruction. Truth. By 1875, Rose Freeman was a respected figure in the black community of Ontario. She ran a school with over 60 students. She had published 3 books. She was known as the woman who had died and come back to life, but she was also aging. The years of hard labor, the trauma of slavery, the difficulty of the escape, all of it had taken a toll. Her health was fragile. She tired easily. One day in spring of that year, Ruth received an unexpected visitor. A young white man appeared at her door. He introduced himself as Marcus Henderson, grandson of Samuel Whitmore's sister. He had traveled from South Carolina specifically to meet her. Ruth felt her heart freeze, but she invited him in. Marcus sat uncomfortably in a small parlor. He was perhaps 25, well-dressed, educated. He looked nothing like his great-uncle, but Ruth could see the family resemblance. "I read your book," he said finally. Ruth said nothing. "I came to apologize," he continued, "for what my family did, for what they were." Ruth studied him. "Why?" "Because it was wrong. Because I can't undo it, but I can acknowledge it." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Ruth spoke. "Your apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring back the people who died. It doesn't restore the years that were stolen. I know, but I accept it anyway, because someone in your family finally had the courage to speak the truth." Marcus nodded. He looked at her with eyes that were ashamed and sad. "What happened to the plantation?" Ruth asked. "Burned down in 1864. Union soldiers. The family lost everything in the war." Ruth absorbed this information. The great white house, reduced to ashes. The fields, abandoned. The system that had seemed so permanent, so unbreakable, destroyed. "Good," she said quietly. But Marcus stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "You died in those records, but you're the one who survived. My family's name is ruined. Yours will be remembered." After he left, Ruth sat alone in her parlor for a long time. She thought about revenge, about justice, about the difference between the two, and she smiled. On 1897, Rose Freeman received an invitation that would change everything. The invitation came from the Ontario Historical Society. They were organizing a conference on the history of slavery and the Underground Railroad. They wanted Ruth to speak. Ruth was 72 years old by then. Her hair was white, her movements slow, but her mind remained sharp. She accepted the invitation. The conference was held in Toronto in October. The audience included historians, educators, journalists, and descendants of both slaves and slaveholders. The room was packed. Ruth walked to the podium with the assistance of a cane. The audience fell silent. She did not use notes. She did not need them. She had told this story hundreds of times, but never in such a public forum. "My name is Rose Freeman," she began. "According to the official records of the Whitmore plantation in South Carolina, I died in September of 1858, an animal attack in the swamp. My body was never recovered. My value was calculated at $800. She paused, letting the words sink in. "But I did not die. I escaped, and I have spent the last 39 years making sure that what happened on that plantation is never forgotten." For the next hour, Ruth spoke. She described the plantation in detail, the quarters, the fields, the violence. She named names. She read excerpts from her books, from the testimonies she had collected, from the very ledgers that had once declared her property. The audience listened in stunned silence. Then Ruth did something unexpected. She pulled out a piece of paper yellowed with age, carefully preserved. "This is the original ledger entry that declared me dead," she said, holding it up. "I obtained it from the South Carolina archives 3 years ago. I want you all to see it." The paper was passed through the audience. People stared at the neat handwriting, at the crossed-out name, at the calculated value of a human life. When the paper returned to Ruth, she looked out at the crowd. There are people in this room who believe slavery was not that bad, who believe their ancestors were kind masters, who believe the system was justified. She paused. I want those people to look at this paper. This is what slavery was, reducing human beings to numbers, crossing out their names when they ceased to be profitable. This is the truth. A man in the audience stood up. He was elderly. Mrs. Freeman, my grandfather owned a plantation in Virginia. He treated his slaves well. Not all slaveholders were monsters. Ruth looked at him calmly. Sir, your grandfather treated people as property. That makes him a monster, regardless of how he fed them or clothed them. The man sat down, his face red. Another person stood, a young black woman. Mrs. Freeman, how did you survive? How did you keep going? Ruth smiled. Because they wanted me dead, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. The conference continued for 2 more days, but Ruth's speech was all anyone could talk about. Newspapers reported on it. Editorials were written both praising and condemning her, but the most significant outcome came a week later. The Ontario Historical Society announced that they were creating an archive, specifically for testimonies of former slaves. They offered Ruth the position of curator. She accepted. For the next 4 years, Ruth worked to build the archive. She solicited testimonies from across Canada and the United States. She preserved documents, recorded oral histories, created a comprehensive record of slavery and resistance. The archive became her life's work. It was housed in a small building in Toronto, open to researchers and the public. Ruth spent her days organizing, cataloging, ensuring that the stories would survive. In 1900, a young historian named Margaret Clark came to the archive. She was writing a book about slavery in South Carolina and wanted to access Ruth's materials. Over weeks of research, Margaret became fascinated, not just with the documents, but with Ruth herself. She interviewed Ruth extensively, recording her stories, her insights, her reflections. Why did you do it? Margaret asked one day. Why go to all this effort to document these horrors? Ruth thought carefully before answering. Because they tried to erase us. They tried to reduce us to nothing, to cross out our names and move on. I wanted to make sure that every person who was enslaved, every person who suffered, every person who resisted their names would be remembered, not as property, as people. Margaret nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, do you have regrets? Yes, Ruth said simply. I regret leaving my brother. I regret not being able to save everyone. I regret that it took a war to end slavery, and that even then, freedom came slowly and incompletely. But you don't regret escaping. Never. That conversation appeared in Margaret's book, published in 1902. The book was titled Voices from the Ledgers, The Lives Crossed Out by Slavery. It became a standard text in university courses, but Ruth never saw it published. In 1901, shortly after her interview with Margaret, Ruth fell ill. It was pneumonia, common in the elderly. She was taken to a hospital in Toronto, where doctors did what they could. Ruth knew she was dying. She was 86 years old. She had lived longer than most people of her generation, especially those who had endured what she had endured. Her son Moses came to be with her. He was 58, a respected minister with a large family. He held his mother's hand. I'm proud of you, Mama, he said. Ruth smiled. I'm proud of you too, son. You were born free. You'll die free. That's everything. She paused, her breathing labored. Promise me something, she said. Anything. Tell the story. Make sure your children tell it, and their children after them. Don't let anyone forget, I promise. Ruth closed her eyes. She thought about the swamp, about the moment she had decided to die so that she could live. She thought about the ledger with her name crossed out. She thought about all the people she had left behind, all the people she had helped along the way, and she thought about Samuel Whitmore, Thomas Garrett, all the people who had tried to own her. They were dead now, but their names lived on in her testimony, marked forever as perpetrators of atrocity. She had won. Ruth Freeman took a final breath, then she was gone, but her story remained. The funeral was held at Daniel Mason's church, though Daniel himself had been dead for 15 years. The building was packed. People came from across Ontario, from Detroit, from as far as Pennsylvania, former refugees, descendants of refugees, historians, educators, people whose lives Ruth had touched. Moses Freeman delivered the eulogy. He stood at the pulpit and looked out at the crowd. My mother was born into slavery. he began. She was given a name by her and she was listed in their ledgers as property, valued at $900. When she escaped, they declared her dead and crossed out her name. He paused. But she didn't stay dead. She refused to be erased. She lived for 53 years after they declared her deceased. She taught hundreds of students. She wrote books. She built an archive. She made sure that the truth would survive. Moses pulled out a piece of paper. It was the ledger entry, the one Ruth had displayed at the conference. This paper says my mother died in 1850, but we all know that's a lie. The only thing that died that day was her bondage. Everything else, her spirit, her will, her determination, that survived, and it's still surviving. In this room, in all of us, the congregation murmured agreement. After the funeral, people lingered. They shared memories of Ruth, stories she had told them, lessons she had taught. They spoke about her courage, her intelligence, her refusal to be defeated, and they made a decision. They would ensure that Ruth's archive survived. They would raise money, recruit volunteers, expand the collection. The archive would be Ruth's living memorial. In 1903, the archive was officially renamed the Rose Freeman Memorial Archive of Resistance and Liberation. It became a permanent institution, funded by donations and supported by scholars worldwide. The archive grew over the decades. More testimonies were added, more documents preserved. It became an essential resource for anyone studying slavery, resistance, or the Black experience in North America. Ruth's books were republished multiple times. Her testimony was taught in schools. Her name became synonymous with courage and survival. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was the simplest one. In 1920, a young woman named Grace Holloway, a distant descendant of one of Ruth's students, visited the archive. She was researching her family history and came across Ruth's story. She read Ruth's testimony. She saw the ledger entry declaring Rose dead. She learned about the escape, the journey, the life Ruth had built, and Grace, who had been struggling with her own challenges, her own sense of powerlessness, felt something shift inside her. If Ruth could fake her death to escape slavery, if she could walk hundreds of miles to freedom, if she could build a new life from nothing, then surely Grace could face her own difficulties. Ruth's story gave her strength. This happened over and over. Generation after generation, people encountered Ruth's story and drew courage from it. Students, activists, ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. All of them found something in Ruth's testimony that spoke to their own struggles. The archive preserved Ruth's words, but the words did more than sit on shelves. They moved out into the world. They inspired, they educated, they transformed. By 1950, the Rose Freeman Memorial Archive had become one of the most important collections of slavery testimony in North America. Scholars traveled from around the world to study it. Documentaries were made, books were written. The Whitmore family name, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. The descendants who remained distanced themselves from their slaveholding ancestors. The plantation itself was long gone, its location marked only on historical maps. But Ruth's name endured. In 1998, a historian making census records came across something extraordinary. In the 1901 Canadian census, there was an entry for a woman named Rose Freeman, age 6, born in South Carolina in 1830-5. The historian compared this to South Carolina plantation records, and there it was, the ledger entry declaring Rose deceased in 1858. The discovery made headlines. The woman who died but didn't die. The woman who erased herself to become free. Museums created exhibits. Documentaries were produced. Ruth's story reached millions of people who had never heard it before. And in St. Catharines, Banthouse, Ontario, the small house where Ruth had lived for over 50 years was designated a historical landmark. A plaque was installed outside. In this house lived Rose Freeman, 1835 to 1912, who escaped slavery by faking her own death, survived a dangerous journey to freedom, and devoted her life to educating others and preserving the truth of slavery's horrors. She refused to be erased. Today, descendants of the Freeman family gather every November 2nd, the anniversary of Ruth's arrival in Canada. They read from her testimony, they share her story with their children and grandchildren, and they repeat her words, the words she spoke on her deathbed. They listed me as dead. I listed them as monsters. Only one of those things was a lie. These words had become a rallying cry. A reminder that those who try to erase you, who try to reduce you to nothing, can be defeated, not through violence, but through survival, through testimony, Through Truth, Ruth Freeman's ledger entry still exists, preserved now in climate-controlled archival storage. Researchers can request to see it, can trace the neat handwriting that declared her deceased, can see her calculated value, but next to it, in the same archive, are Ruth's books, her testimony, her collected interviews, hundreds of pages documenting not just her life but the lives of countless others who were enslaved, who resisted, who survived. The ledger tried to cross her out. She wrote herself back in, and in doing so, she wrote a record that will never be erased. The Rose Freeman Memorial Archive continues to operate today, now housed in a modern building in Toronto. It contains over 10,000 documents, including original testimonies, plantation records, letters, and photographs. Students visit on field trips. Researchers consulted for dissertations. Descendants come searching for their own family histories. And in a special display case, under careful lighting, sits the original ledger page, Rose's name, crossed out with a single line of ink, and beside it, her response, a photograph of her taken in 1900, when she was 65 years old. In the photograph, she is seated in a chair, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair is white, her face lined with age, but her eyes are bright, clear, undefeated. Beneath the photograph is a caption, written in her own hand, "I am Rose Freeman. I was born enslaved in I was declared dead in 1858. I died free in 1912. This is my testimony. This is the record that survives, not the slaveholder's ledger. Though it exists, not the plantation's archive, though it remains, Ruth's record, her testimony, her truth." She refused to be a number on a page, a crossed-out name, a forgotten loss. She chose instead to be a witness, a teacher, a voice that would not be silenced. And she succeeded. Wherever her story is told, in classrooms, in museums, in books, in conversations between generations, Ruth Freeman lives. She faked her death in a swamp in South Carolina, and then she spent 50 years proving that she was very much alive. They tried to erase her. She wrote herself into history instead, and that, in the end, is the most powerful revenge of all. End of record. The testimony of Rose Freeman is preserved in archives across North America. Her words continue to educate, to inspire, to bear witness. She was listed as dead in 1858. She was found alive in 1901, and her voice lives still, refusing to be forgotten.